Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Many listeners would remember the Australian Wheat Board affair, which came to light almost 20 years ago. After all, it was Australia's biggest ever corruption scandal, where wheat exporter AWB Limited paid $300 million in kickbacks to Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. It made international headlines and forever changed Australia's monopoly wheat export system. And at its centre was a small group of wheat sales executives who became the face of this massive corruption scandal. Now, a new podcast explores exactly how it unfolded by talking to the executives who found themselves in the eye of the storm. It's called Baghdad Nights, and it's the third season of the Secrets We Keep podcast. The host is journalist Richard Baker, who covered the story 20 years ago and is now seeing a different side of it altogether. Richard, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks very much, Sean. Great to be with you.
I remember when this story was done, you worked for a long time on it. Is it one of the highlights of your journalism career?
Yeah, I think so. It's certainly one of the most interesting stories I've worked on, just because there are a million rabbit holes you could go down, and it's got a bit of everything. It's got, obviously, the trade and business dynamic between Australia and Iraq and the United Nations overlay through this World Food Program, but also then the wild card of the United States in there, who were our battlefield ally in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, but our bitter trade enemy when it came to selling wheat to that same market. So it's just got all these angles and personalities, and then it blew up into this massive media and political storm in Australia that kind of gave rise to Kevin Rudd. It was the platform that he surfed to prominence on. So yeah, definitely one of the best stories I've worked on.
So those not familiar with the story, just run us through it, the thumbnail sketch of what happened and how the kickbacks worked.
So in the late 90s, the Australian Wheat Board was still a government-owned corporation, and it was the only way Australian wheat farmers could sell and market their wheat overseas. It had the monopoly on Australian wheat exports. And Iraq was increasingly one of its strongest markets, and Iraq couldn't grow enough wheat, and its economy was being crushed by economic sanctions designed to rein in Saddam Hussein's sort of warmongering tendencies. And we found ourselves, AWB found themselves in an increasingly good market whereby Iraq was paying great prices for Aussie wheat, buying millions of tonnes. It was generating a lot of wealth in rural Australia and keeping the National Party happy, which they were the junior member of John Howard's coalition government back then. And it was all done under the auspice of the United Nations, which had set up this thing called the Oil for Food Program. And basically what that was a way for Iraq to sell its oil on the world market, but the money would be stored in an account overseen by the UN, so Saddam couldn't buy, plutonium or weapons of mass destruction. And they could then order food and medicine through that. And AWB became the biggest supplier of humanitarian goods through that program. Over 4 years between 1999 and 2003, billions of dollars. Now, the catch was that Saddam Hussein's regime had the wheat board over a bit of a barrel when Australia was joining with the United States and the UK in making ultimatums on him to give up his weapons of mass destruction, and then ultimately leading to the 2003 invasion. And what happened was he basically said to AWB, you want to keep selling to me, I'm going to get a bit more money out of this. I'm going to whack on 15, 20% to these wheat contracts, say that they're trucking fees or transport costs, and I'm going to pocket about 300 million out of this that I shouldn't have.
Stay with me, Richard. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Richard Baker, journalist and host of the podcast Baghdad Nights. So there were some pretty, we talk about the political ramifications, but just the individuals involved. There were some pretty colourful characters, including one a fantastic photo, which I still remember so well, a big man with a bit of a beer gut and a gun, no shirt on. Tell me about those guys.
So that's Trevor Flugie you're referring to there, who was the man at the Australian Wheat Board while all this was happening. He was the chairman of the board and very hands-on chairman, so often flying around the world, including into Iraq, to deal directly with ministers and officials to sell heaps of Aussie wheat. And that photo of Trevor, I actually got that as a young reporter at the age when this scandal was red hot in about 2006. And it's the only time I've ever paid for, I guess, a story, or in this case, a photo in 25 years in journalism. And a young woman came in and basically handed me a disc and said, I think there's some things on here you'll be interested in.
Oh, wow.
And I took him upstairs and I saw that photo with the gun and the shirt off and the sweaty face. And I thought, yeah, I got to have this. And I just went down and said, I can get you about $800. Take it. Let's do a deal. So, yeah, even in a story about bagmen and middlemen, I was kind of acting like one. And we put it on the front page and it went off because it helped distill what we thought the story was at the time, that these guys were just cavalier cowboys who'd do anything for a deal.
Did you get to speak to any of these guys for your podcast?
I did. So, yeah, Trevor Flugie is pretty much the main character in the podcast. And why he's of interest, obviously, he was chairman right throughout this period of time when these controversial deals were done. But that photo was taken when he was actually in Iraq as one of the most senior Australian government representatives in the American-led authority that was governing Iraq after Saddam Hussein had been gotten rid of. So Trevor was there on a $1 million taxpayer-funded contract representing the Australian government. And so he was incredibly politically connected as well, and the organisation was, which is why I think it's interesting, because I've always found it hard to believe that the government would have so much care to use its kind of leverage with the Americans to embed Trevor and two other of my main characters in the podcast, Michael Long, who was one of AWB's gun salesmen, and Daryl Hockey, who was their political advisor. They were also sent into Iraq in senior officials by the government. And so if the government cared that much about maintaining AWB's presence over there, I find it hard to then understand how it didn't know kind of how it was doing its business.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty incredible. You talk about the political ramifications and Kevin 07. Just explain that.
So this scandal broke really hard in late 2005 when the United Nations had done a very extensive investigation into the corruption of its oil for food program. It was being rorted left, right, and centre. Well, not just by AWB. And when that report finally came out, it was pretty big news, and there was a lot of pressure from overseas, but also at home for John Howard, who was the Prime Minister at the time, to get to the bottom of it. Now, Kevin Rudd was the Labor opposition's foreign affairs spokesman at the time. He didn't have a massive public profile. I think he'd just started doing that brekkie shift on Sunrise with Joe Hockey. Yeah. So this was right up his alley, and he was really clever at distilling the complexity, and he came up with phrases like the wheat for weapons scandal, and basically was saying that the Howard government had gone into this really controversial war in Iraq in 2003, which by 2005 was already turning out to be a pretty bad thing. But we were secretly paying the guy we were going to war against $300 million he shouldn't have had.
Yeah.
And he was just in the media day in, day out, hammering it. And it really allowed him to raise his profile to the extent that he could challenge Kim Beazley, who was the opposition leader then, and then, of course, defeat Howard at the next federal election.
Richard Baker, you've been a journalist for a long time. Did you learn much during the podcast that you didn't actually know before?
Yeah, I did, Sean, in all sorts of different ways. So one of the things I didn't know to the full extent that I do now, having done this, was that the process of how AWB got Trevor and the other two blokes embedded into Iraq in 2003, that was AWB's own idea. It wasn't the government's idea, but they were able to get meetings with John Howard and the Foreign Affairs Minister Alexander Downer sort of in mid-2002 to say, we need to have these roles because we need to be in a position to know what the Americans are going to try and do once they take control, and be in a position to try and stop that. Now, what's interesting about that is, of course, the Australian public hadn't been told that we were going to go to war because John Howard said he hadn't made his mind up, and only made his mind up weeks before we joined the invasion in March 2003. So that intimacy between the Wheat Board and the government, it doesn't surprise me, but I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So I found that really interesting.
Yeah. So at Baghdad Nights, you can presumably on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you get a decent podcast. Is that right, Richard?
Yeah, at all the usual podcast outlets.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Sean.
That was Richard Baker, journalist and host of the podcast Baghdad Nights. This is the Fear and Greed business interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.